I'm glad to be with y'all and to talk with you about a topic that is really kind of coming out of my research. So when the conversation was had about what to do tonight in conjunction with what you've been doing thus far, it was plug in kind of what you bring to the conversation. So leadership and I've really been working around with, I'm in the Department of History, Politics, and Philosophy. And so one of the areas I've been researching, I had a sabbatical last semester, and spent the whole semester doing some research on the area of political theology. Now that may or may not be a term that means a whole lot to you, but that's all right. We can nonetheless kind of work around any unfamiliarity. So I want to kind of start with this, or not. There we go. So when you hear the word politics, there are formal definitions and there are informal definitions, connotations and denotations, right? So we could talk about kind of the dictionary says, right? So you go back to the etymological roots, the Greek here, politics, the things that we share in common as fellow citizens. Or to draw upon the Roman Republic, the idea of the Republic was the people's thing. It is kind of our work. Now, we can again talk about the formal definitions, but when I say the word politics, what comes to your mind? Trump. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You can be honest. Or just a thing? A very bad thing. So why do you think Trump comes to mind?
It seems like he's all in order to talk about when it comes to
Okay.
our eventual election.
Yeah. So we're in the midst of a presidential cycle, and there's lots of conversation and public dialogue about politics, and this is the people's thing. This is the enterprise that we're engaged in together. So we think about individuals who kind of put a face on this for us. What else comes to mind when you think about politics? Sir?
Power.
Power, yeah. It is the exertion. People who have power usually manifested in the political realm, and they direct things rightly or wrongly, appropriately or inappropriately. So other ways to think about this, and this is kind of where I would kind of add to the conversation. Politics are these practices and policies that organize our life, the well-being of the polis. The polis is simply the city, our community. So when we talk about politics, it's supposed to be those practices and policies that organize us. There are, in the United States, over 300 million of us. So politics is the way we together structure how are we going to live together? How's this going to work? What are the practices that we value and promote? What are the policies that we hold one another accountable to? Does that make sense? So we start thinking about what are the rights of being a member of this polis, this community? And so we often think about the Bill of Rights as an articulation of our rights as members. How do we distribute the wealth and the resources of our community? Do we do it this way or that way? That's a political decision. Do we say everybody gets the same, or do we throw some incentive in the process and say you can get what you can pull off and keep? What do we do about safety and security? Those are political conversations. What do we do when somebody offends us as a polis, as a community? How do we hold them accountable? What is appropriate justice? Whether you're talking about wealth distribution, safety, and security, how do we decide how we're going to do things? How do we answer all these other questions? So does that make sense? In the best sense, I would argue, politics are these things that hold us together. There's lots of factors in life that push us apart. Could be race, could be class, could be ethnicity, could be gender, could be fill in the blank. All kinds of things are pushing us apart. What is going to hold, in our circumstance, 300 plus million together? Is that making sense? We tracking all right? So when you start talking about political theology, you're going to talk about these types of questions. Now, we've had people who maybe are not approaching it from the theological point of view. Rousseau said we answer these questions by the general will. We get together, the general will decides our political policies and practices. Or Jeremy Bentham said, no, it's not up to the general will, it's the greatest good for the greatest number. So we debate these all the time, historically. Not just our community, but every polis wrestles with these questions. Fair enough? But we come at this, I would suggest, as members of the Lipscomb community, not just saying, well, what works necessarily, but we bring to it the question of our faith. So we're not necessarily asking different questions. In fact, the questions are pretty much the same. What are the rights of members of this community? How do we distribute wealth and resources? How do we protect the integrity of every member of our community? But the challenge here is to say, I'm not just thinking about this from a pragmatic or just simply utilitarian point of view. I'm going to say, I'm committed to a faith. And my faith is going to inform the way I'm going to answer or engage those questions. Does that make sense? So political theology is asking those same political questions, but intentionally bringing your faith to bear in that conversation. We tracking all right? We feel all right? Or like, wait, I'm not sure I'm following. Got it? We're good. Now I'm going to suggest for our time together that when you start looking historically at political theology, you're going to see kind of three general categories where people fall out on their political theologies. When people of faith bring their faith to these questions, they're going to gravitate in different directions. No surprise here, right? People of faith don't always agree. They're all people of good intention. So I'm not casting aspersions on anybody's approach, but we can historically watch people of faith engage these questions and come up in different locations. And as we watch people in the past, we can say, I like that one. Or, that's crazy. No, not that. So we get to kind of use them as a case study. It's sort of like watching game film. Why do football teams watch game film? That's an old game. Ain't nobody gonna play that game again. Why do they play? Why do they watch game film?
To learn from it.
To learn from it. What might they learn from it?
What plays didn't work.
Yeah, we ran that play. It looked really good on paper. Not so much on the field, right? Maybe we need to just pull that one out of the playbook. Why else watch game film?
Learn about the other team.
Learn about the other team. Yeah, it's a little intelligence gathering. What are they inclined to do?
What the other team is.
Yeah. So we're kind of analyzing. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're getting a chance to look at game film on political theology and say, I like that. I don't like that. Make sense? So I want to kind of highlight these three, but I want to invite you into the conversation. Now, some of you know, I'm looking around the room. I've seen a few of you in class, sometimes recently. Sometimes I tend to be a little, what's the right word? Ornery. How about ornery?
It works.
Okay. Because I'm trying to invite you into the conversation. So I want to push the envelope sometimes to say, come on, what do you think? And so to get the conversation going this way rather than this way. All right? So my job is to kind of set things up and then see where the conversation goes. Because sometimes when you talk, what are the two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite conversation?
Politics.
So don't expect a polite conversation. How about that? Because that's what this is, politics and religion. So we start with this first group, the transformationists. Now, sometimes people will refer to this group as conversionist in their approach. And so a transformationist is going to say people of faith engaging those questions about the polis. What they aspire to do is to acquire the political power that can transform the polis toward godly ends. Now, some of you would be familiar with Augustine's City of God, a classic text in Western literature. And he's juxtaposing the city of God versus the city of man. So keep that metaphor. Sometimes people talk about two kingdoms. That's another way of referring to this. So what they're going to say here is, what we want to do is we want to convert or transform the city of man, the world in which we live, into something that looks a whole lot more like the city of God, the kingdom of God. So that's what we're striving to do. We're trying to move in that direction. So the ends are outcomes that we're striving for, a more godly society on this earth. How do we pull that off? Well, it could be by passing laws. If you pass the right laws and can enforce those laws, you can get the masses to move in that direction. Or you can simply throw in some economic incentives. You can encourage certain behaviors. Or you could throw in what I put up here, social suasion. Education. You could train people over the course of their educational career to kind of move in a more godly direction. So that society, or push comes shove, you can just force people. You can put enough coercive power on them where they will comply even if their heart's not in it. You can force their body even if their heart and mind don't go along with it. Make sense? So a transformationist, the whole point here is our job as people of faith in this community is to move this community from where it is to where it should be. And we define this changing the world. Okay. Let me put some historic examples to this. The Puritans. We love the Puritans, right? Great, fun-loving group of people. We usually have some pretty unfortunate preconceived notions about the Puritans. Fair enough. Uptight, not particularly happy. But in fact, if you engage and listen to the Puritans define themselves, what they're going to say is they feel a calling, that God has called them on an errand. This is not, this migration from England to create New England is not for themselves. It's not some great personal benefit. They are called by God to go create in the New World what they call a Bible commonwealth, so that all the political systems and structures will be there to sustain, support a rigorous discipleship. So everything about the social and political order of Puritan New England is going to be intentionally designed so that they're moving toward the creation of a Bible commonwealth that will make life on earth closer to something like the kingdom of God. That's pretty ambitious, very optimistic. Fair enough? So, for example, only people who attained a status of visible saint were empowered in Puritan New England with civil rights. Only people who were visible saints could vote or hold elected office. Now, what does it mean to be a visible saint? Well, let's just say it wasn't easy. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah has moved to New England. And Sarah has decided she wants to be a visible saint. And we say, great, Sarah, we're glad that you're going to take on this challenge. The first thing we're going to put you through is a Bible test. we want to make sure that you know, in fact, the Bible backwards and forwards. So it's a pretty demanding Bible test. If she passes the Bible test, then we say, Sarah, why don't you recount for all of us how you were converted? And so you walk through your conversion narrative. And we start questioning on you. How do you know that was the work of God? Was it a warm feeling? How do you know it wasn't indigestion? You know? Could you be mistaking the Holy Spirit for something you ate? I don't know. So there's a real give and take, kind of pushing her. Is she all that she aspires to be? If she passes that test, we're going to say, give us some references. And we run your references. Does somebody know you? And they can attest. I know Sarah. She's good. She's good to go. She is ready to live the expectations of this Bible conference. Folks, I kid you not, there were 14 tests you had to go through to become a visible saint. If you passed every one of the 14 tests, and only if you passed the 14 tests, was your name held up before the congregation of already established visible saints, and they voted. Had to be 100% unanimous. If there was one person that said, you know, I like Sarah, but I'm just not sure she's there yet, we'd say, why don't you try again next year? If you got visible saint status, you passed all the tests, 100% vote in, yes. You thought social clubs were tough, right? Try being a Puritan. This was only good in the congregation, the one congregation that gave you visible saint status. If you moved, you had to start all over. So the whole thing was, let's make this, the people who hold these political powers and privileges, so difficult so that only visible saints would be the ones who vote or hold office. Only visible saints would be the ones who have access to the sacraments of the church, in this case, baptism and the Lord's Supper. But you see what they're trying to do? Are they trying to be mean and bitter and narrow and exclusive? You might kind of feel that way a little bit, right? Kicking people out, holding people to tests, etc., etc. But they're saying, no, what we're really trying to do is to put people in power who will help us all move in the direction of the kingdom on earth, so that it is more godly. It is a Bible commonwealth. Does that make sense? John Winthrop's the governor. He stands on board his flagship, the Arbella, in 1630, and says, before we leave, folks, we're still here at dock in England. You need to know what you're signing up for. This ain't for everybody. If you think you can live this, come on. If you think this isn't for you, hop off right now before we leave. Because we are going to be as a city on a hill. The point here isn't to be something for themselves. Look at us, how great we are. No. We want to be the example so that the world can see and say, now that polis is a good polis. I want to be like that. Why don't we do something like that? Why aren't we more like a Bible commonwealth rather than just the typical city of man? Does that make sense? So that's what they're aspiring to, and how their theology drives them. They're trying to transform their city of man into something that looks more like the city of God on earth. Questions here, reactions. You like it? Got any Puritans that want to sign up? Woohoo! I'm in. So that's one approach. Let's move the calendar forward. Let's move several years ahead. Let's move to the early 20th century. Another individual who had the same political theology. I want to convert or transform the city of man into something more like the city of God on earth. His name, Walter Rauschenbusch. Bless his heart having to learn how to spell that last name as a kid, right? Notice what he says here. He's saying the kingdom of God is not a matter of getting individuals into heaven, but of transforming life on earth into the harmony of heaven. There's that transformationist notion, that conversion. We're not going to talk about sometime after we die, pie in the sky by and by. We're talking about transforming this world something more along the lines of the kingdom of God. And look what he was talking about, what drove him to this. For 9 years, Walter Rauschenbusch lived in a section of New York City that was affectionately nicknamed Hell's Kitchen. Not because Gordon Ramsay ran a restaurant there, but because it was so horrendous to live in this environment. Here are pictures from that moment. Folks, there are buildings in this neck of the woods where you have upwards of 500 people per square acre living in tenement houses with no indoor plumbing. How does that work? You got 500 people. Imagine your dorm, yeah? No indoor plumbing. And frequently, no windows. What happened when Mother Nature called? You just had a bucket, and they kind of passed the bucket around, and when the bucket got full, somebody had to take it outside and dump it. You had thousands of standing cesspools of raw human sewage. These places like this, you got a furnace here, the wood stacked there. These things could go up in flame in no time. Walter Rauschenbusch said, that's the city of man. It doesn't look anything like the city of God. God's people should not have to live in places like this. And the church ought to be saying something about it. What strikes you about this picture? What do you see? So you see children playing, right? There's a dead horse right there. And so here we have a drainage ditch. Anybody want to guess what's probably going up and down that drainage ditch? So evidently what happened here is somebody's going by with a cart and his horse keeled over. What do? You unhook the dead horse and you leave it. What happens when kids play in raw human sewage next to decomposing flesh? They get sick. Illnesses, plagues run rampant through these areas. And he's like, church, do we say we got something, we got a message for this? Or are we just going to say, whatever? So he's calling for the transformation, the conversion of that world into something better, and the church is supposed to step up. The church is supposed to define our political engagement of places like Hell's Kitchen. Washington Gladden, he was from Columbus, Ohio. Any Buckeyes? There's one. Two, got two. So he was a minister at a very influential congregational church in Columbus. By the way, I put up here, anybody know the song, "Oh Master, Let Me Walk With Thee"? Matt does. Most of our younger folks, yeah. It was, at that time, a kind of anthem, a call. "Oh Master, let me walk with thee in lowly paths of service free. Help me to see, help me to bear the fret of toil, the pain of care." Or that may be the other way. But it's something along those lines. And he's like, I can stand up here in my fancy, safe, comfortable pulpit and say, somebody ought to do something about that. But he decided, maybe that somebody should be me. And so he ran for city council. He's going to transform, he's going to convert the situation. And when he got elected to the city council, he's like, one of the things I want to do is to make transportation available to folks who can't afford it. I want to Make sure that utilities are available to all the public, not just for those who have the means to afford it, or to have electric lines strung to their house. Or, what's a blue law? It's a term we often don't use anymore, but it was very significant at that point. Anybody ever heard of a blue law? Okay, so pretend Matt's not over here. We'll just talk amongst ourselves for a second. If you go over to Trader Joe's or Kroger's on Sunday morning, there is one item in that store that you are prohibited from purchasing. Not that a Lipscomb student would necessarily know what would be prohibited on Sunday morning to purchase, but it might be alcohol. Why is that? Pardon? That was it. That was the essence of a blue law. Was we may not be able to control you every day, every hour of every day, but on Sunday morning, this is the Lord's day, and we can write a law that says you're not going to buy any alcohol. And so a blue law, which was to say we're going to move society a little bit in the right direction through legislation. Some of these still persist. Anybody else kind of encountered any of these types of laws, these blue laws? Used to be that stores had to be closed on Sunday, or certain types of establishments, theaters, movie theaters couldn't be open on Sunday. So that was kind of the intent. One last transformation. Martin Luther King Jr. Listen to his message when you hear footage from a documentary or you read some of his speeches or writings. When he talks about what he's up to, he's often very clear. He envisions the beloved community. A polis that is driven, that is inspired, that is informed by biblical principles. When asked, "What are you after, Dr. King?" he would frequently say, "To save the soul of America." Yeah. Seats on a bus. Yes. Seats at a lunch counter. Yes. The right to vote. Yes. But all those were means to the end of saving the soul of all of America. Black, white, otherwise. And so the way that he would do it would be things like in Montgomery in 1955, an economic boycott. You're going to treat us like second-class citizens? Our faith says you don't do that. And so we will use the powers at our disposal. In this case, we can't vote, but we can vote with our funds. We'll stay off buses. We'll use that type of coercion or power to sway the conversation, or ultimately to get legislation or to get the courts to pass laws that says you can't do that. You can't treat members of your community like second-class citizens. So you see how they're working to transform the situation? Anybody heard of Sojourners? Jim Wallace, their organization's headquartered in Washington, D.C. I think Jim Wallace probably helps describe some of this for our setting. So I have him queued up here. Let's listen to Jim Wallace for a second.
I believe it is time to revive an ancient idea, but one that is so timely right now. It's called the common good. It means to not just look after ourselves and our group, but to really understand that we are our neighbor's keeper. How do we work with those?
Well, apparently we won't listen to him. Acknowledge. Okay, so.
I believe it is time to revive an ancient idea, but one that is so timely right now. It's called the common.
We'll just stop on that one. Less is hard. What we say in the South, right? So what he's saying here in this book, and what he would have talked about in this advertisement for his book, is that we need to engage in the political processes so that we can move society toward the common good. So he's going to say, as people of faith, don't bracket your faith, bring it into the public square. Use your faith to inform and inspire you as you pursue, for example, legislation that would distribute the resources of our society as the way you believe people of faith should. So this is the feedback loop here. So I've been talking. I want to hear what you're like, wait, okay, I'm not following. Or what needs clarification? How do you hear this transformation? We talked about Puritans, we talked about Rauschenbusch and Gladden, we talked about King, we hear very briefly Jim Wallace. Reflect back to me what you hear the transformation is saying. Sir?
What I gather, they seem to use like political power.
Yeah.
Whatever the religion or
Yeah. Yeah, there are millions of Christians in American society. If they bring their collective power together in a block, they can influence elections, they can encourage legislation. Yes, ma'am?
Well, it seems like it's borderline pushing against separation of church and state.
Say more.
Well, I mean, if you're using your Christianity to influence your political decisions, that's one thing. But to bring Christianity into politics is the very thing that America was started to get away from. We have two separate things, church and state. There's been many arguments against that, and it seems like the transformationists are kind of not about separation of church and state.
Yeah, that line between them starts getting a little fuzzy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not entirely clear. And yet, a Jim Wallace might say, for example, but we're not telling people where they have to go to church on Sunday, or even that they have to go to church on Sunday. We're simply saying there are millions of us Christians in this country, and we can together bring our interests to bear and try to encourage legislation that would move society in a better direction.
But how would that, so, as America, in a sense, becomes less of a Christian nation, it's not as religious as it used to be, is that still serving the greater, the greater number of people
Right.
versus just one individual group?
Yeah.
It's one thing if that was, still the large amount of people majority, but if we're moving away from that, are we still serving the
Sure.
group?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think they might say, but yeah, it is serving the greater good, and maybe it's precisely at this moment where people of faith should step up. In this moment of decline, this is all the more reason to engage in this way, to help make sure that society does move in a proper direction, in a more godly direction.
I feel like as Margaret was saying, that it does kind of walk that line of involving church and state. But I think even nowadays, even using religion to inform your opinion about something makes you controlling or trying to create or trying to do the exact same thing, even if it's just how you perceive things as they
Sure.
should be. And so I feel like it almost is self-defeating, even if you're just using it to inform your opinion.
Could be. Could be. But what do? If you're a person of faith and you say, I believe this, these are values I hold very dearly, and I think my faith has a vision for society that is better than the vision society is currently operating with, can you just say, I guess I'll keep it to myself?
I think it's a fine balance. I don't think you need to keep it to yourself because then you would sort of just citing your own perspective.
Sure.
But I think you hold firm in what you believe, but also realize that not everyone agrees with that.
Yeah.
And not everyone realizes or agrees that your vision is the best vision. And so it's a part of holding firm, but also being able to work with other people.
Right.
You're going to get a lot farther in influencing other people's vision of the world by living that out versus forcing or imposing, restrictions on behavior.
Yeah. And that was one of the great gifts of Dr. King, for example, in the movement. They walked into the public square and they were very forthright with their God talk, beloved community. But they were also quite savvy at working with folks who didn't always see the world precisely the way they did. And the goal was to win everybody over so that we all become the beloved community, rather than just, we're going to get ours, sorry about you. That kind of dynamic. So there are some good models. There are probably some models where, okay, that's just tyrannical. What's your name?
William.
William. You can imagine they're like, William, I know what's good for you, and I'm going to make you live that way. Do you feel liberated when I do that?
No.
No. How do you feel?
Still oppressed.
You feel oppressed because I'm being patriarchal, right? It's paternalism. It is, I know better than you. I don't know why you don't see it properly. So since you won't see it properly, I will make you. That does feel oppressive. So you can see what drives people toward this, but you could also see potential dangers. So that's one model, yeah? So, here's another. Sometimes referred to as the realists or the dualists. And a classic realist or a dualist is going to say, boy, the world is a train wreck. Human beings are given to all kinds of atrocities and sin. And you know what? You get power, you're really not likely to change much. In fact, power probably will corrupt you in the process. So this whole thing of beloved community and kingdom of God on earth ain't going to happen. It just isn't in the cards. It's not realistic, is what they would say. So you don't try to change the city of man into the city of God, because that's just not the world we live in. So what do? Well, you live in the tension, and you pivot or you toggle. Sometimes I have to think and act like, in our case, a citizen of the United States. And other times, I will go ahead and I will say, now I'm a person of faith. But I don't bring these two together, I keep them apart. And I try to be thoughtful and savvy in pivoting or toggling between the two identities or the two roles, as the circumstances, the realities, merit which one I have to do. For example, apparently, yesterday, ISIS bombed the airport in Belgium, right? In Brussels. Can you just say, ISIS, I love you, and I want you to change. And I'm going to love you until you change. And ISIS will go, oh, okay. And we all sing Kumbaya. A dualist is going to say, that sounds really nice, and let me know when you find the rainbows and unicorns. But we don't live in that world. We live in a nasty world where there is real evil that is unlikely to change. So the wise and judicious disciple is going to be the one who appreciates, it's ISIS. We got to deal with ISIS in the way that ISIS will respect. They will respect power. They will not respect love. And so sometimes you're going to have to use the hard-hitting political strategies, the force. Sometimes you pivot over, you toggle over, and you say, okay, now I'm about turning the other cheek and love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness. But that doesn't always work. So I got to know when to use which. Make sense? the guy I would like to put before you for this perspective is a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr. Sounds like I'm drawing a lot of German characters, right? Walter Rauschenbusch, Reinhold Niebuhr. You see there his dates. He was professor up at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. One of the few theologians to actually make the cover of Time magazine. Here's what he's suggesting. We often wish we lived in a good versus evil world, but we don't. The real world is evil versus evil. It's only degrees of evil. Human beings, profoundly sinful. Left to their own devices, likely to do far more harm to their neighbors. Pretty much incapable of making any sustained sacrifice for other people. So at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to check power is straight up power. So when you overwhelm, for example, ISIS with a greater power, then they say, gotcha. So here's the challenge. You're going to have to weigh the evil you face, the enemy, against the evil you are going to have to commit to stop that greater evil. So it's not like, what's my good option here? You don't have any good options. The only option you have is an evil one, and you need to just go ahead and embrace the reality. Act pragmatically with a sense of humility, saying, yep, I'm a person of faith, and I'm about to sin. And I'm going to sin intentionally. I'm not happy about it, and I'll repent as soon as I'm done. But I'm going to do it.
But is that actually true repentance? Is it?
That's a good question, isn't it?
Isn't that repentance more turning away from this action?
Well, I'll turn away as soon as I get done with it.
But then you're just going to turn back to it the next time. But
I'll feel bad about it. I'll feel guilty. I won't be happy. I'm like, yeah, I showed ISIS. It's like, I really feel bad about what we did to ISIS. Like, no more ISIS. Yeah, it's like, I don't know about this. So you're like, I know what I'm about to do isn't Christian. Let's just get it over with. Here's Reinhold Niebuhr. He's like, we can talk about love. And in fact, he says, Jesus said, love your enemy. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. But you know what? That just doesn't work in the real world. So be remorseful, be penitent, but be active. And as a Christian, once you create some pain and suffering, look to make amends, knowing full well that you did that. You like this one? No? Why not?
I don't think it's real faith if you're not believing in the power of God to be able to change situations on earth. Like, He can't handle it.
Maybe God put you on earth for just such this purpose. Let me put it this way. Reinhold Niebuhr is living in the midst of the Cold War. The arch enemy of the United States in the Cold War is the Soviet Union. They're communists. They're atheists. They're doctrinaire atheists. They have a nuclear arsenal that could toast this planet. What do I say to them? As a person of faith. I walk up to them and I say, that's a good arsenal you got. I got one better. You launch one, I'm launching 10. You scare them into submission. Is that the righteous, holy thing to do? No. Does it work? Did for 70 years or so. Where's the Soviet Union today? Gone. So because they were realists, the evil was eradicated. And so now we're sort of penitent for that.
I think there's a lot of benefits to kind of working a political life out of this lens, just because I don't know, you see people like Ben Carson. I mean, he's just a big figure. There's a lot more like him. They sputter out because people realize that literally everything that they're going to do or say is all going to be influenced by their faith. And a lot of people feel that there's areas of life where that's just not applicable. And also, I know just within politics that I've observed is people that only do things with God in mind don't ever end up actually doing anything. They can never get anything passed. They can never get any support on anything because it's just not encompassing of everyone. But people who kind of have more of a backseat faith, where everything they do is influenced by their faith, but they address it in not such a like a Bible beater kind of nut in that way. When they go about it more of a worldly stance, they're oftentimes able to make impactful change for their faith and in their community, but just without sticking that label. I'm a Christian. This is for Christian purposes.
Yeah, sometimes politics is just a nasty game, right? Sometimes you got to cut a deal with people that you really don't like. But it's like, I'll give you this if you give me that. And so, you got to do some wheeling and dealing. Do you feel good about it? Yeah, probably not. Does it help achieve your objectives? Sometimes it does.
But is there a difference between wheeling and dealing and completely, this whole idea of pivoting?
Yeah.
It makes me think that it's two very opposite ends of the spectrum. That's sort of the idea that's coming up, that you're going from sort of vast extremes.
Yeah.
And, how can you say that you actually believe in anything? But it's sort of like you're trying to be two places at once, but one's in, one's put out.
That's right. We are stuck living in two kingdoms. I am a person of faith. I'm committed to the kingdom of God. Am I a citizen of heaven? I hope. I try to that. But am I also a citizen of the United States and have to achieve the national interests of the United States? Yeah, I do. And sometimes that means I have to do some really unchristian things for the United States. I don't feel good about it, but I'm stuck in this real world. And so I have to kind of pivot or toggle between my two allegiances.
I still feel like one citizenship has to come first, though. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
you may deviate that, you may bring in other perspectives, you may work with other people so you can actually get things done. But to completely abandon one based on the circumstances makes it bigger, not totally rooted in either.
I can see that.
Well,
Sir.
I just feel like in some situations you don't have one person just standing in front of you when you go, and that person may only want that one deal. And sometimes to whether let's say you're a Christian, let's say you are trying to change society, you might have to deal with that person for the greater goal that you have. So I can understand where this one is coming from. Like you said, this is a real world. Not everyone believes in the same thing or have the same views that you have, and sometimes you just have to deal with them in that situation.
There are some mean, nasty people out there. And sometimes in order to move things in the direction they need to go, you got to deal with those incredibly sinful folks. Sometimes you got to cut deals with them. Sometimes you got to cut them out of the situation altogether. It's kind of nasty, but that's politics, right? So Transformers, right? We're going to use politics to move society from the city of man to something more like the city of God. Dualists, they're going to do this pivoting, toggling thing between the two. Now, I'm not making a political statement here. I just found his speech when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and I hope this works, that you'll get to hear him. He actually, in the front of, as he's receiving his award, gives, I think, a very clear description of this realist approach. So, hoping that this works.
What I do know is that meeting these challenges will require the same vision, hard work, and persistence of those men and women who acted so boldly decades ago. and it will require us to think in new ways about the notions of just war and the imperatives of a just peace. We must begin by acknowledging a hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates.
Come on, work.
In our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But as a head of state, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But as a head of state, sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. But make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. A nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies. Negotiations cannot convince Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, it is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. I raise this point. I begin with this point because in many countries there is a deep ambivalence about military action today, no matter what the cause. And at times this is joined by a reflexive suspicion of America, the world's sole military superpower. Yet the world must remember that it was not simply international institutions, not just treaties and declarations, that brought stability to a post-World War II world. Whatever mistakes we have made, the plain fact is this: the United States of America has helped underwrite global security for more than 6 decades with the blood of our citizens. And
So what's he saying? What do you hear him saying in this speech? Again, while receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. How do you translate what you just heard, sir?
Sometimes violence is necessary.
Yeah. He's saying, hey, thank you for the award, and I'm mindful of the fact that Dr. King was here some years earlier, and in fact, I'm here because he did his work, and he had that approach of nonviolence, comma, but, and he goes on to say, sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do.
I mean, I think he's pretty much saying that he was not only serving his faith, but he's also serving the American people. So
Yes.
serving two masters, and he has to do what he has to do as president, as this one representative.
That's right. He took an oath of office that said, I'm here to protect, and I have that responsibility.
And I just feel like, I think it's not everyone American Christians who are going to have that
Sure.
same idealism. Like, yeah, he's a Christian, but he's not just protecting Christians, he's protecting everyone in the country.
Yeah.
So he's responsible for all those lives. I mean, it's just a road that's not fit for everybody.
Sure.
So like, not everyone's going to agree with it, but I mean, sometimes you just, like you said, you got to do what you have to do.
Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. You got to pivot. You got to toggle between the roles, the responsibilities. You might not be happy about it. You might feel guilty about it. But that is the responsibility you bear. One of the reasons why I call your attention to this, when he was running for election in 2008, one of the questions that he was asked was, who's your favorite theologian philosopher? He said, Reinhold Niebuhr. He's elected, and sure enough, you hear him give what I think is a pretty clear articulation of the philosophy of Reinhold Niebuhr. Interestingly enough, he's not alone. In 2008, the same question was posed to both Hillary Clinton and to John McCain, and they each said, in separate circumstances, their favorite theologian / philosopher was Reinhold Niebuhr. So Reinhold Niebuhr in political circles, he's kind of the go-to guy for political theology. That's not to say they're anti-faith, it's just a recognition that especially people who bear the vocation of politics feel themselves torn between two kingdoms. And that the challenge is to wisely and even faithfully work between those respective kingdoms and the systems. Make sense? Man.
I feel like there's almost a sense of religious, I'm not even sure what the right word is, but kind of like what she was saying, you know, because we are Christians, there's some sort of like external pressure that we can only serve one God. And so if you hold any other sort of opinion, they're like, well, then maybe you're not a real Christian.
Yeah.
And then that puts people up in arms because it may not be an actual reflection of who you are. And I think that this sort of like deals with it because you're having like a dichotomy of,
Sure.
you know,
Sure.
how do I kind of please both sides of my heart, I guess.
Yes. And a sense of both sides of my responsibilities. I could imagine a world that were otherwise, but that world's in my imagination. I live in this world where I've got some folks around me who are up to no good. And I've got to use means that will stop them in a way that they respect. So you kind of see this. All right, so let me ask you this. Anybody's like, no, I'm a transformer. If these are my options, I like this. I like the approach better, being a transformer. My job is to bring my faith and to try to move the city of man closer to the city of God. Anybody like, yep, I'm that one. I got one. I'm going to be an auctioneer here all of a sudden. Can I get two? Can I get two? One. I got one. Can I get two? Two. Got two. Three. Okay, we won't go this too far, but you get the idea. Why so? Why transform?
Because I very seriously take what I read in the Bible, and I think that you can't serve two gods and you can't make anything an idol above God. And if you are putting anything aside, if you are suppressing anything and saying, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to the Bible right now for this so I can do the greater good, then that's just not what I believe in personally.
Okay. What would you add?
I'm not a person that approaches but it just makes me that transformation is just like, it's been proven in my opinion to be better because I mean, look at Latin America, and you know, Catholicism was forced upon those people, and now they're normally actually more into Catholicism than people in Europe who adopted it, you know, out of their own free will. You know, so I just see that. Yeah, I think that actions transform like the way you feel on the inside over time. So yeah, at first you may not like it, but as time goes on, like as you keep doing those actions, your heart's going to eventually come in, or the heart of your children is going to be. So,
Yeah. So it might over the course of time work, sir.
I mean, I just wouldn't want to live in a society like that. That's like me saying to you, if I keep beating you, eventually you'll like it. I don't believe that. Like, that's just not.
I mean, I'm not saying I want it to happen to me or anyone else, but I'm saying, like, just if you're going for people to adopt your faith, that's the way to go.
I mean, I'm just saying. I'd rather have my free will and my autonomy than have something forced upon me.
Yeah?
That's just me personally.
That's right. And that's what we're doing. We're bringing which one of these is kind of pulling at you? Is there one's like, yeah, that one makes more sense to me because I kind of like dualists. It's like, yeah, no, that realist approach, I get that. Anybody? We got 1, 2, 3. Why's up?
I mean, it seems the most practical.
Okay.
You know, obviously it's not really like a compromise in faith. You just have to be real about where you're at right now, your situation.
Okay.
Because, I mean, I don't think God calls us to be ignorant of the world around us. We're not of the world, but we do live in the world.
Sure.
And I think you have to remember that it doesn't affect your allegiance to God at all. It just affects the decision you make.
Okay. Sir.
I'm so bad. I think that sometimes we really want to abandon the world because we want to withdraw to our faith and we don't want to get involved in things too much. I think it is also our job as Christians to make the world a safer place for people. And I'm not advocating we do terrible things for that, but I am saying that we can't just, it is also our job while we are here to make the world a better place. I think that realism takes that approach and it allows for you to make calls against people who are doing really terrible things, whatever that may be. But
Yeah.
I mean, I just say there's been more work there involved in your surroundings.
Okay.
And I think you're dealing with that. So
Yeah.
certain people you wouldn't want to deal with like another group of people.
Right. Sometimes
That's how I view it.
you don't always use the hammer when a softer touch will do, right? But sometimes, in fact, the hammer may be required. And so you're savvy, you're attentive to what is going to be needed. Convinced? No? He was like, I don't like either of these options. Well, what would you like? Oh, well, you saw this. Yeah. All right, well, this is America. America's all about options, right? You go to the grocery store, there are 47 types of ketchup. So we have options. Incarnation. So an incarnation approach is going to say, yeah, we do in fact, I get the tension that we are pulled between living in the city of man, but also aspiring to the city of God. But the city of man, the city of God is not going to convert or transform the city of man. The city of God is not going to transform or convert the city of man. Moreover, the incarnation is like, this pivoting thing, this toggling back and forth, no, can't do that. So what do? Well, you say, I acknowledge that I'm in a pretty rotten environment, the city of man. It's inclined to all kinds of atrocities and injustices. I don't like any of them. And I'm not going to try to acquire the power to write legislation and enforce the legislation to change, because I don't think the city of man is redeemable. It's not going to change. The city of man's always going to be the city of man. So what do? You say, I am a citizen of the kingdom, and I'm going to live the ethics, the values of the city of God, the kingdom, in the middle of the city of man, even if it looks utterly stupid, inefficient, unrealistic. Because that's what I believe I'm called to. So it might be inefficient. It might be ineffective. People will look at you and go, you're not being relevant. What you're doing is not germane to what's going on in the real world. But you say, I don't care. I don't care if the world gets the genius, the mystery of love. I'm going to live love even if it gets me killed. I'm going to be forgiving Even if people abuse me in the process, I'll just do. I'll try to live to incarnate the kingdom in the middle of humanity, irrespective of the consequences. Does that make sense so far? You're going to be in an ocean of darkness, that one little spot of light. Again, come what may. Here's an example. Clarence Jordan. He's from southwest Georgia. Any Auburn fans in the room? There's usually one or two around. No? Yeah? What's the football stadium? What's the name? You didn't know there was going to be a tip?
Yes, it is. I know it is. Okay, I don't remember, sorry.
Jordan, and it's spelled like that. So they're in the region, it's often referred to, it looks like Jordan, but they sort of say Jordan. Whatever the reason. Minor point. You see here, this is a guy who's born into a family. His daddy's a banker, so they've got means. He gets a pretty good education, goes to the University of Georgia there in Athens, works on a degree in agriculture. He will ultimately leave the ROTC because he feels drawn by Christian nonviolence. Will pursue the ministry, will work on graduate degrees at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary up in Louisville, Kentucky. Is a Greek scholar, and started saying, this racial division, this Jim Crow policy in this country is fundamentally wrong. But what do I do about it? This is the 1930s. What do you do in the 1930s when the whole society around you is living by practices and policies that you find reprehensible? Do you say, well, I'm going to pull together a political movement and we're going to change this. We'll get elected. We'll write new legislation. We'll enforce that. He says, no, I don't think that's what we're called to. In 1942, he moves back to his home in Georgia. He moves actually a little further down. With a friend of his, Martin English, they buy 400 acres down near Americus, Georgia. And they will start a community, a farm. Koinonia, Greek word for community. And he said, this is what we're going to do. At least on our demonstration plot, on our farm, in the midst of this society that's practicing segregation, we're going to treat every human being with dignity and justice. We will choose love over violence. We will share our possessions for all who live there. We will live simply, so it's kind of Acts 2, if you will. And we will be stewards of the land and its natural resources. This is his agricultural background coming out. So his idea was, we want to take the early church and see what it would look like in southwest Georgia in 1942. We're going to take the Sermon on the Mount, and it will be our Constitution, not the Constitution that guides the United States of America. And again, how's that going to go over in southwest Georgia in 1942? Not so well. They tried to run a little business. They grew pecans. Their little hut where they sold pecans, it would get trashed, blown up. People drove by, shot at them. They really took it. In fact, Clarence Jordan in 1968, if I remember correctly, died of a very treatable heart condition because no physician in the area nor any pharmacist would treat him for his heart condition. And so he died in a relatively early death because he was ostracized. And his point was, Jesus called me. Jesus says, pick up your cross. That's an instrument of death. So instead of trying to power one way I'm going to change all of Georgia. Why don't you change yourself? Just be it. Live it. You don't have to enforce or legislate. Be the interracial reconciliation. Be the nonviolent community during the Cold War. Be communal in a society that tends to be driven by individualism. From his Sermon on the Mount book. If you sign up like this, you're going to get persecuted. You're probably going to get crucified, whatever that looks like in your context. But you always remember that crucifixions have a way of being followed by resurrections. That's our story. Jesus didn't say, love your enemies, because it was a great tactic. It's your calling. And yes, in fact, you're going to be at the mercy of your enemies. And if somebody says, sorry, but that just doesn't strike me as relevant, you say, I'm not striving to be relevant. I'm striving to be faithful. Or one more, Dorothy Day. You see there her dates. So a contemporary of Clarence Jordan. About your age, she enrolled at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Not unusual. She gets into that point as a young adult and says, I'm checking out of traditional formal faith. I don't buy it. Christianity tends to side up with those with already holding privilege. So she becomes, she says, an agnostic, not atheist, just, I don't know. Denounces World War I as a war that's likely to fund the munitions makers, but it's the poor folks who got to wind up in the trenches. In 1917, she's going to work for women's rights, especially the rights of women to vote. She will protest outside the White House. She'll get arrested. She goes on hunger strike and is force-fed. When she gets out and after the war, she becomes a reporter, a journalist for a magazine that was a newspaper that had a socialist bent entitled The Call. But after a while, her conclusion was, I get what the socialists are calling for, but I still don't think they're right either. Her point is, why make those sacrifices for somebody else? I like the idea of the sacrifice and working together and supporting community, but why? In fact, only faith can give you the reason, the justification, the rationale to make the sacrifices necessary. Why care about the poor and the marginalized? Just because it's the right thing, or because there's a deeper calling? And so for her, faith became very significant again. Christianity offered a better politic. But she was still frustrated that the institutional formal church tended to side with people with privilege. And so she had this tradition. I'm not sure we recommend it for everybody, but it seemed to work for her. She would, when she got mad at God, which was frequently, she would go to a church and she would walk in, get on her knees, and say, all right, God, I'm here, and you're going to listen to me because I'm mad. And she would just kind of rail at God and say, there you go, God, what are you going to do now? I'm waiting. So that's a pretty bold approach to things. You know, this is what she would call a prayer protest. I'm protesting God. Come on, respond, she's saying. Well, careful what you pray for. Sometimes you're not good. After one of her prayer protests, this guy showed up. She goes home, and he's literally standing at her front door. And she's like, who are you? And he's, I'm Peter Martin. Like, what do you want? And I want to start a community. And so together, the two of them started what become known as the Catholic Worker Movement. To this day, there are over 200 Catholic worker houses on every continent, I think, save Antarctica. I don't think they've opened up a house for the poor and marginalized of the penguins or whatever, I don't know. But they are everywhere, and they have this sense of mission. They're not going to try to work to acquire the power of the system. They're not going to try to make history turn out correctly. They're going to actually renounce the political system and challenge through protest, try to break convention, fracture the order that tends to define the world, to provoke, to annoy, to disrupt. Because in that moment, being this alternative, this counterculture, it can open the way to what is not accessible in the other models, the transformationists and dualists. So she's all about agitation and disruption and disobedience. This is Dorothy Day. City of New York required fallout drills, nuclear. There would be a test. The same way that you do the kind of fire drill at school. Back in the day, you would have to do a nuclear drill. And she said, I'm not going to do that because I don't believe in nuclear war. And so when you were supposed to go to the fallout shelter, she would go out with her placards and protest and get arrested. And like, there, I showed you. And like, showed us what? Showed you that your approach, your thinking is not seeing everything it needs to see. It's not as clear or as deep as it needs to be. What she's trying to do is to create a new society in the shell of the old, she said. In the city of Maine, create this alternative community that lives by kingdom values. So she wouldn't pay federal taxes. And ironically, after she fought to give women the right to vote, she never cast a ballot. Because that's part of the process, part of the system. She's pulling out of the system to go against the grain. Here she is later in life, and she's about to get arrested yet again. Her rap sheet was rather long in nonviolent civil disobedient actions. So you like that one? I got any incarnation like, yeah, now that's what I was waiting for. Not this dualist, not this transformationist. I like the incarnations. Yeah? I got one. Did we get two? Two? Still just one. Win them over. 1.5.
I just like the way that I see it is like if you really want to see big lasting change or something like that, I don't see a way that you can really vote it into office. You're not going to get that by like I'm not going to affect big things through my Christian faith through voting on someone. The way I'm going to do it is through small scale grassroots efforts that grow and grow from like a local standpoint, from just stuff that you do yourself outside the political realm. That's what I see being more successful if you want to actually change something about the situation because of your Christian faith.
What about Chad?
Well, I agree with it. My issue is, like Christianity, it's not easy.
Right.
And so that's where I'm like, well, being a realist, I think would be easier. And I agree with incarnational, but it's just the difficulty of realizing that you're putting yourself to death.
Yeah, political death. It is a kind of political death. Society's going to look at you and say, you're not relevant. And you're like, okay, so be it.
In an ironic sense, it almost seems like that people would look at her and think that her obstinance is like not being Christian. Like people might see it as like, well, like if that's what a Christian does, why would I want to be involved in that?
Right. Yeah, and her response is going to be, this is the Christian message, to offer this counter. Clarence Jordan, for example, to be this demonstration plot. That I'm not going to try to tell you how to live. I'm just going to try to live the way I think I'm called to live. And let that be what it's supposed to be. And God will give the growth however God envisions that growth being.
Is that like because I'm more leaning to like mix between realist and that one, because I do believe in beliefs that you should follow the laws of like, that's what I'm just doing, but also live in realist aspect of the world. So they're like a mixture, like something that's more mixed.
Yeah, so if we had a spectrum, there are kind of places where you start moving from one to the other, and the lines are by no means right or precise. It can be a little fuzzy, so you kind of watch, and at this point, what that might look like. Yeah.
I think part of it is kind of like situational. Like, for example, I wouldn't really want our president to be like anything but a realist necessarily, because I mean, if someone is about to like bomb us, then I would want someone who's going to say to us, be like, hey, don't do that because, you know, we'll retaliate. But at the same time, you know, like I do think that we are called to live a life that is like set apart from like a very countercultural life. But I don't know if I agree with everything that Dorothy Day did, because I mean, in terms of like paying taxes and voting, like even Jesus said, like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. So I mean, I don't necessarily think that we're called to completely live apart from society, but we do have to like resist a lot of things.
In a way, I feel like America at one point did kind of practice the incarnational way when it was kind of in an isolation period, when it didn't really deal with the rest of the world. And during that time, it allowed the world to kind of grow darker. And while you can be a light in the darkness, you can still be swallowed by the darkness in a way. And your light might not be strong enough. And so I think, in a way, you can't just practice incarnationalism, even as a nation as a whole, because in that way you're tossed to the wayside, and instead of bettering the world in the way that you kind of want to through your way of living by living as an example, you don't carry the influence as you would if, say, you were to practice a realist way where you were to involve yourselves in the lives of others while also carrying your ideals with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I suspect that a nation could never kind of live the incarnational. That it would be kind of a distinct calling that would wind up as the minority in society. Because I think the others are going to hold the majority of folks, whether the dualists or the transformationists. The incarnational, they're likely to be kind of few. Clarence Jordan and his group living down there near Americus, Georgia, kind of living their thing. But most people would never have known much beyond that region that they existed. So yeah, which one, you know, how do you measure? Are you looking for impact? Are you looking to shape the course of history? You know, what is it that you're using as your ruler for deciding which political theology you're kind of compelled to? Did I see?
Yeah, I have a hand up. Sort of back on this, I like the description that's up there for incarnational, but I didn't like the execution, especially the execution presented by Dorothy Day. And the thing that I took issue with a lot was the statement about almost annoying. But the one that I did think was interesting was disruptive. So within the technology community, which is sort of the field and industry that I'm entering, disruptive is seen as a good thing. It is, if you are a disruptive company, you are changing the industry that you're entering by presenting a new and better idea.
Yeah.
But it's not in an annoying way. And so there's parts of that that I like, but I think sort of what Caroline is going off of, I think if you are annoying or abrasive and sort of turn people off, they're not going to listen. And you can't be so removed. I feel like if you're so focused on, I'm just going to do me and I'm going to be removed from the world, that's kind of selfish that you're and limiting people by not willing to share it.
I think they would say they're in the world. I think they might say they're going to try to be salt. better example of leaven. That leaven is a small thing that gets into the lump, and it somehow or another does its magic. And so they don't know how, and they're not going to try to control, and they're not going to try to be the political system. So they'll be there, but they're just going to kind of be that little thing that starts its magic. Yeah. So let me just wrap up here. Historically, and I've just looked at the United States, you can trace these models back across the last 2,000 years and find case studies of individuals who kind of appropriated elements of this. A kind of, I want power to help move the society that I find, my moment in history, in a more godly direction. Other people, yeah, I feel responsible, but I feel pulled between conflicting identities. And so the thing to do is to kind of be this individual who pivots or toggles between the two kingdoms. And others who have been more prophetic, perhaps, in this incarnational approach. The question is to look at them, their game film, for your game, your life, your leadership. As you go out and you start living out your political theology, what's it going to be? How can you draw upon the resources of the past to help you make the impact you feel called to make? So my prayer is that you all kind of embrace that challenge and live your life as you are called to live. Thank you.